Seattle's most beloved butcher had a secret recipe that kept customers coming back for decades. When investigators finally searched his cold storage in 1985, they found something that would haunt Pike Place Market forever. If you want to hear the full story, subscribe now and don't miss what happens next. The rain hammered against the weathered windows of Pike Place Market as it had done for over 70 years. The historic building stood like a guardian over Elliott Bay, its neon signs reflecting off wet cobblestones below. Inside, vendors arranged their stalls with practiced efficiency, preparing for another day of commerce. The smell of fresh fish, mixed with roasting coffee and baked bread, creating the distinctive aroma that had become synonymous with Seattle itself. Thomas Brennan arrived at his butcher shop precisely at 4:30 in the morning, just as he had done every day since 1978. He was a large man, standing 6 feet 3 inches tall, with powerful shoulders developed from decades of cutting meat. His hands were massive, capable of breaking down an entire side of beef with remarkable speed and precision. At 52 years old, his brown hair had begun to gray at the temples, giving him a distinguished appearance that customers found reassuring. He wore the same outfit every day, a white apron over a plain button-down shirt and dark trousers, with steel-toed boots that had been resoled multiple times. The shop itself occupied a corner position in the market's main arcade, a prime location that Brennan had secured through a combination of persistence and an unusually generous lease payment. The storefront featured a large glass display case that ran the length of the counter, always immaculately clean and filled with perfectly arranged cuts of meat. Behind the counter stood the cutting area, visible to customers, where Brennan performed his craft with theatrical precision. What customers could not see was the back room, accessible only through a heavy steel door that Brennan kept locked at all times. Brennan unlocked the front entrance and stepped inside, immediately feeling the familiar chill of the refrigerated space. He had designed the shop's cooling system himself, insisting on installing industrial-grade equipment that kept the entire workspace at a constant 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Other butchers in the market complained about the cost of such elaborate refrigeration, but Brennan considered it essential to his business model. He moved through the shop with the confidence of complete familiarity, checking his equipment and preparing for the day ahead. The display case needed to be restocked. Brennan disappeared into the back room, emerging minutes later with several large cuts wrapped in white butcher paper. He arranged them in the case with artistic care, ensuring that each piece looked appealing to potential customers. The labels he placed beside each cut were handwritten in his distinctive block letters: premium sirloin, choice tenderloin, special house blend ground. That last item was his most popular product, a proprietary mixture that customers swore tasted unlike any ground meat they had purchased elsewhere. By 6 o'clock, the market was beginning to come alive. Rachel's ginger beer shop across the way had started serving its first customers. The flower vendors were arranging their bouquets. The fish throwers at Pike Place Fish Market were practicing their famous salmon toss. And at Brennan's butcher shop, a line was already forming. Margaret Chen was always his first customer. The elderly Chinese woman had been buying meat from Brennan since his second week in business. She arrived every Tuesday and Friday morning, purchasing exactly 2 pounds of his special ground meat. She made dumplings with it. She had told him once, and her family considered them the best in Seattle's International District. Brennan greeted her warmly, wrapping her order with extra care. "Your meat is always so tender, Mr. Brennan," she said in her accented English. "What is your secret?" Brennan smiled, the same practiced smile he gave every customer who asked that question. "Good suppliers and careful preparation, Mrs. Chen. That is all." But it was not all. Thomas Brennan had many secrets, and the source of his meat's distinctive quality was perhaps the darkest among them. The morning rush continued for 3 hours. Brennan worked with efficient precision, never hurrying but never wasting motion. He recommended cuts, offered cooking advice, and occasionally threw in extra portions for his most loyal customers. By 9:30 the initial wave had passed, and he could take a brief rest. He poured himself coffee from the thermos he brought from home every day. He never drank the coffee from the market vendors. He never ate anything he had not prepared himself in his small apartment in the Ballard neighborhood. Brennan had moved to Seattle in 1977, arriving from Chicago with impeccable references and a substantial amount of cash. He told people he had worked in the stockyards there, learning the butcher's trade from his father. He said his family had all died in a house fire, and he had come west to start fresh. None of this was true, but Brennan had learned long ago that people rarely questioned a sad story told with conviction. His real name was not Thomas Brennan. He had been born Theodore Breckenridge in Gary, Indiana, in 1933. His father had indeed been a butcher, but he had taught his son far more than how to cut beef and pork. The elder Breckenridge had certain appetites, certain philosophies about the nature of meat and humanity. Young Theodore had been an eager student. By the time he was 19, he had developed his own understanding of these lessons, an understanding that eventually required him to leave Indiana permanently. He had lived in 7 different cities under 6 different names. Each time he had worked as a butcher. Each time he had eventually been forced to move on. But Seattle was different. Seattle was working. In Pike Place Market, surrounded by noise and crowds and constant activity, Brennan had found the perfect cover for his activities. The market was a place where everyone minded their own business, where eccentric behavior was expected, where a man could keep his secrets without arousing suspicion. The lunch crowd brought a new wave of customers. Office workers from downtown came to purchase steaks for their dinner. Young mothers bought ground meat for their families' meals. Restaurant owners placed large orders for their establishments. Brennan accommodated them all with professional courtesy, maintaining the persona of the reliable, slightly reserved craftsman who took pride in his work. Among the regular customers was Detective Robert Morrison of the Seattle Police Department. Morrison had been buying meat from Brennan for 3 years, stopping by the shop every couple of weeks to pick up steaks or roasts. He was a homicide detective, though Brennan had learned this information casually, never showing particular interest. Morrison was in his late 30s, African American, with the careful eyes of someone trained to observe details. But even he saw nothing unusual about the butcher shop. Brennan made certain of that. "How's the tenderloin today, Tom?" Morrison asked, studying the display case. "Exceptional," Brennan replied. "Just received a new shipment yesterday. Very well marbled, perfect for grilling." Morrison selected 2 large cuts, and Brennan wrapped them with his usual precision. As he worked, he noted the detective's wedding ring, the slight coffee stain on his shirt collar, the worn leather of his shoulder holster just visible beneath his jacket. Brennan noticed everything. It was how he had survived for so long. The afternoon brought the tourists, people visiting Seattle who had heard about Pike Place Market's famous butcher shops. They took photographs, asked questions about the different cuts, and usually bought something small as a souvenir of their visit. Brennan was patient with them, understanding that tourists meant money, and money meant security. At 3 o'clock, during a rare lull in business, Brennan retreated to his back room. The space was larger than customers might have guessed, extending deep into the building structure. The front portion contained legitimate supplies, boxes of butcher paper, spare knives, cleaning supplies, extra refrigeration units. But beyond a second steel door, accessible only with a key that Brennan kept on a chain around his neck, lay the real workshop. This inner room was Brennan's domain, the place where he did his actual work. The walls were lined with stainless steel, easily cleaned. The floor had drains at regular intervals. Industrial lighting eliminated all shadows. A large butcher's table dominated the center of the space, its surface scarred by thousands of cuts. Along one wall stood a row of meat lockers, their compressors humming constantly. And in the far corner, almost invisible, unless you knew to look for it, was a small access door that led to the market's old cold storage area, a warren of rooms and corridors that predated the building's major renovations in the 1970s. Brennan checked his supplies. He had enough for perhaps another week, but he would need to acquire more soon. The process of acquisition was always risky, requiring careful planning and perfect execution, but it was also necessary. His customers expected a certain quality, a certain distinctiveness to their purchases. He could not disappoint them. He spent 20 minutes sharpening his knives, a meditative process that he found calming. Each blade had to be maintained with obsessive care. The dull knife was dangerous, inefficient, unprofessional. His collection included boning knives, breaking knives, butcher knives, and several specialized tools that he had designed himself. Some of these implements would have puzzled a conventional butcher, but Brennan found them indispensable for his particular methods. At 4 o'clock, Martha Simmons arrived. She was one of Brennan's most loyal customers, a woman in her 60s who had been shopping at Pike Place Market since childhood. The husband had died 2 years earlier, and she now lived alone in a house in the Queen Anne neighborhood. She came to Brennan's shop twice a week, always ordering the same items: 1 pound of the special ground meat, 2 pork chops, and whatever roast looked good that day. "Mr. Brennan, you are a godsend," she said, as she always did. "I do not know what I would do without your shop. The quality of meat at the supermarkets is simply deplorable." Brennan packaged her order, adding an extra pork chop without charging her. Small gestures like this built loyalty, created goodwill, made customers feel special. It was an investment in his security. "You are very kind," Martha said, genuinely touched. "My son is coming for dinner this weekend. He lives in Portland now, works for Nike. I am going to make your meat into my special meatloaf. He has been asking for it since Christmas." Brennan smiled warmly. "I am sure it will be wonderful, Mrs. Simmons. Please give him my regards." After she left, 3 more customers came in rapid succession, and then the evening lull began. Business at the market slowed considerably. After 5 o'clock on weekdays, the office workers had gone home, the tourists had departed for their hotels, and the local residents who shopped at the market typically came in the morning or during lunch. Brennan used this time to clean his equipment and prepare for the next day. At 6:30, he locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed. The market itself remained open until 7, but Brennan liked to give himself time for thorough cleanup. He wiped down the display case, sterilized his cutting surfaces, and mopped the floor. Everything had to be perfect. A clean shop was a respectable shop, and respectability was Brennan's most valuable asset. At 7:15, he went into the back room for the final time that day. He checked the locks on the inner door, verified that the temperature in his special lockers remained constant, and made notes in a ledger that he kept hidden behind a false panel in the wall. The ledger contained information that no one else could ever be allowed to see: dates, measurements, observations about quality, and preparation methods. It was simultaneously a confession and a cookbook. Brennan left the market at 7:45, exiting through the back loading dock, as he always did. He walked to his car, a nondescript Ford sedan that he kept meticulously maintained. The drive to his apartment in Ballard took 25 minutes in light traffic. He lived on the 3rd floor of a building that had been constructed in the 1920s, one of the few structures in the rapidly changing neighborhood that still retained its original character. His apartment was sparse, almost monastic. A single bedroom, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a living room that contained only a chair, a television, and a bookshelf. The books were an eclectic collection: butchery manuals, cookbooks, texts on food preservation, and several works on human anatomy that might have seemed unusual for someone not in the medical profession. But no one ever visited Brennan's apartment, so no one saw his books. He prepared a simple dinner: broiled chicken breast, steamed vegetables, and rice. He never ate his own special meat. That would have been, in his mind, a form of sacrilege. The meat he prepared for others was meant for them, not for him. He had his own ethical code, twisted though it might be. After dinner, he sat in his chair and watched the evening news. The broadcast led with a story about increasing property values in Seattle's tech boom. Microsoft and Boeing were hiring aggressively, bringing thousands of new workers to the region. The city was growing, changing, becoming something different than it had been when Brennan arrived 8 years earlier. Growth meant opportunity. More people meant more anonymity. In a city of 500,000, certain absences went unnoticed. Certain disappearances could be explained away. Brennan had always been careful, but the expanding population gave him additional security. He could continue his work, perhaps indefinitely. The news moved to other stories: a proposal for a new convention center, controversy over the Mariners baseball team, weather predictions for the coming week. Brennan watched without much interest. His mind was already planning ahead, thinking about acquisition, about timing, about the careful choreography required to maintain his operation. At 10 o'clock, he turned off the television and went to bed. He fell asleep quickly, as he always did. Thomas Brennan slept the peaceful sleep of a man who believed he had found his purpose in life. He was providing a service, satisfying a need, creating something that people valued. That his methods would horrify those same people never troubled his conscience. He had stopped thinking in terms of conventional morality decades ago. Outside his window, Seattle continued its restless movement, a city that never truly slept. Somewhere in the darkness, someone walked alone down an empty street, unaware of the attention they might soon receive. Somewhere a future customer was planning their next visit to Pike Place Market, looking forward to purchasing the distinctive meat that had made Brennan's shop so popular. And somewhere, though no one knew it yet, the evidence that would eventually destroy Thomas Brennan was already accumulating, waiting for the moment when coincidence and investigation would finally converge. But that moment was still years away. For now, in the fall of 1981, Thomas Brennan was at the height of his success, a respected businessman in one of Seattle's most beloved institutions. The butcher of Pike Place Market slept soundly, dreaming perhaps of the next day's work, the next customer's satisfaction, the next careful cut of his perfectly sharpened knives. The pattern of Thomas Brennan's life had achieved a mathematical precision by the winter of 1983. Each day replicated the previous, with only minor variations, creating a rhythm that both protected him and sustained his operation. The consistency was not accidental. Brennan had learned through decades of experience that predictability bred trust, and trust was the foundation upon which his entire existence rested. Pike Place Market had become more than just his workplace. It had transformed into a perfectly designed ecosystem that supported his dual nature. The market's controlled chaos provided ideal cover for his activities. The constant flow of strangers meant that unusual behaviors disappeared into the general strangeness of the place. Vendors kept to themselves, focused on their own businesses, rarely questioning their neighbors' methods or sources. The market attracted eccentrics and artists, people who valued independence and privacy. Brennan had positioned himself as simply another craftsman, pursuing his trade with dedication and skill. His reputation had grown steadily. Food critics occasionally mentioned his shop in reviews of the market, praising the quality of his products, without ever investigating their origins. Local newspapers published features about Pike Place Market's artisans, and Brennan was sometimes photographed at his counter, knife in hand, the image of traditional butchery. He deflected requests for interviews with modest refusals, claiming he preferred to let his work speak for itself. This reticence only enhanced his mystique. The special ground meat remained his signature product. Customers developed fierce loyalty to it, claiming they could taste the difference immediately. Some said it had a richer flavor, others detected subtle sweetness, and many simply declared it superior to any ground meat available elsewhere. Brennan never explained his methods, offering only vague references to his mixing technique and the quality of his sauces. The mystery added value. People paid premium prices for products they believed contained secret ingredients. His acquisition process had evolved into a refined system. Brennan never acted impulsively. Every selection required weeks of observation and planning. He sought specific criteria: individuals without strong community ties, people whose absence would generate minimal investigation, those whose disappearance could be easily explained by conventional narratives. The Pacific Northwest in the early 1980s provided abundant possibilities. The region attracted drifters and wanderers, people escaping failed lives elsewhere, seekers looking for new beginnings in the rapidly changing West Coast culture. Seattle's transformation was accelerating. The Boeing Aerospace Company had recovered from the economic crisis of the previous decade and was hiring aggressively. Microsoft, still a relatively young company, was establishing its presence in nearby Bellevue. The University of Washington continued expanding, bringing thousands of students and faculty to the area. This growth created a transient population, people moving through the city without establishing deep roots. For someone like Brennan, such conditions were ideal. His hunting grounds extended throughout the greater Seattle area. He frequented places where isolated individuals congregated, bus stations late at night, certain bars in industrial neighborhoods, areas near the docks where merchant sailors came ashore during port calls. He observed, he noted patterns, he identified vulnerabilities. The selection process took patience, but Brennan had learned never to hurry. A single mistake could destroy everything he had built. The actual acquisitions occurred infrequently, perhaps 4 or 5 times per year. More would have been excessive, dangerous, likely to create patterns that investigators might notice. Brennan understood statistics and probability. Individual disappearances were investigated, but unless they formed a clear series, they typically remained unsolved. Missing person cases in a city of 500,000 people were common, and police resources were limited. As long as he avoided creating an identifiable pattern, he remained effectively invisible to law enforcement. The method varied depending on circumstances, but certain elements remained constant. Brennan always used his van, a white Chevrolet, with no windows in the cargo area, and carefully maintained mechanical systems. He kept it parked in a storage facility in the industrial district south of downtown, paying cash for the rental and using a false name. The van was registered to a fictitious business, with paperwork that would survive casual inspection, but not detailed investigation. He drove it only at night, only when necessary, and always with meticulous attention to traffic laws. His approach was direct and efficient. He offered assistance to someone in apparent difficulty, perhaps someone whose car had broken down, or who appeared lost and confused. His large size and professional demeanor usually generated trust rather than suspicion. Once the individual entered the van, the situation changed rapidly. Brennan was physically powerful and experienced. He used chemical sedation, quick-acting compounds that rendered victims unconscious within seconds. There was minimal struggle, little noise, and no witnesses. he transported them to Pike Place Market through the loading dock entrance, arriving between 3 and 4 in the morning when the building was deserted. The market's overnight security was minimal, focused primarily on preventing break-ins rather than monitoring authorized vendors entering for early preparation work. Brennan had keys to all necessary doors. He moved quickly, bringing his unconscious acquisition into his back room within minutes of arrival. The processing took place immediately. Brennan had learned that delay created problems. The specialized equipment in his hidden workspace made the work efficient. He had designed the space specifically for this purpose, with drainage systems, ventilation that vented into the market's complex air handling system, and lighting that allowed for precision work. His knives were always sharp, his technique was flawless, and his understanding of anatomy was comprehensive. The waste disposal system was equally well planned. Pike Place Market generated enormous amounts of organic waste daily. Fish guts, vegetable trimmings, unsold produce, and meat scraps all went into commercial dumpsters that were emptied multiple times per week. Brennan's contributions to these dumpsters went unnoticed among the general refuse. Certain items required special handling, but the market's location near Elliott Bay provided additional disposal options. Late night walks along the waterfront, weighted packages dropped into deep water during dark hours when no one watched the piers. The actual meat preparation followed butchery principles that Brennan had perfected over decades. He understood muscle groups, fat distribution, and the qualities that made meat tender and flavorful. His products were genuinely superior because he applied professional standards to their creation. The grinding process mixed different cuts to achieve optimal texture and flavor. His special blend combined multiple types of tissue in ratios he had determined through experimentation. Customers were not wrong when they claimed his ground meat tasted unique. It genuinely did. The psychological aspect of his operation fascinated him. The Brennan spent considerable time thinking about the irony of his situation. Hundreds of people consumed his products weekly. They served his meat to their families, fed it to their children, praised its quality to their friends. The Seattle community had literally incorporated his work into their bodies, their celebrations, their daily sustenance. This created a connection that went beyond simple criminal activity. He had woven himself into the social fabric of the city in ways that no one suspected. He kept detailed records of everything. The hidden ledger documented dates, measurements, preparation methods, and observations about results. He noted which cuts proved most popular, which grinding ratios received the best customer feedback, and which preparation techniques produced optimal tenderness. The ledger was simultaneously evidence that could destroy him, and a scientific journal documenting his refinement of craft. He knew keeping such records was dangerous, but the compulsion to document his work overrode caution. The ledger represented his life's achievement. By 1984, his operation had achieved what he considered perfection. The financial aspects were stable. His shop generated legitimate profit that satisfied tax authorities and building inspectors. His customer base was loyal and growing. His security measures had proven effective for 6 years. The risks remained manageable through careful planning and disciplined execution. Brennan believed he could continue indefinitely, that he had discovered a sustainable model for his particular lifestyle. The market itself continued evolving. New vendors arrived, old ones retired or moved on. The Seattle City Council debated various proposals for market renovation and expansion. Tourist traffic increased as Seattle's reputation as a desirable destination grew. Brennan adapted to these changes while maintaining his core operation. He was flexible where flexibility served his interests and rigid where consistency provided security. His personal life remained minimal. He had no friends, no romantic relationships, no social connections beyond superficial vendor camaraderie at the market. This isolation was intentional. Relationships created vulnerabilities, demanded explanations, and generated attention. Brennan's apartment in Ballard contained nothing that revealed his true nature. His van in the storage facility was the only physical evidence of his activities, and even that could be abandoned instantly if necessary. He read extensively, consuming books on butchery, anatomy, food science, and criminology. The criminology texts particularly interested him. He studied investigative techniques, forensic methods, and criminal psychology. Understanding how investigators thought helped him avoid their detection. He learned what evidence they sought, what patterns they recognized, and what mistakes led to arrests. This knowledge informed his operational procedures, making him more effective and secure. The spring of 1985 brought changes to Pike Place Market. The city announced major renovation plans that would modernize building systems while preserving the historic character. Inspection teams began surveying the structure, documenting existing conditions, and identifying necessary upgrades. Building officials appeared regularly, measuring spaces and examining infrastructure. Brennan watched these developments with growing concern. The inspections threatened his operation in ways he had not anticipated. Building officials had access to architectural plans, including areas that had been abandoned or forgotten. The old cold storage rooms that Brennan accessed through his hidden back door were marked on original blueprints. If inspectors decided to examine those spaces, they might discover evidence that even his careful cleaning had not completely eliminated. He considered his options. Abandoning the operation entirely would mean leaving Seattle, establishing a new identity elsewhere, and starting over. This prospect held little appeal. He had invested years building his business and reputation. The market location provided advantages he might never find again. Moving seemed excessive, premature, a response to theoretical danger rather than actual threat. Instead, he intensified his security measures. He spent several nights thoroughly cleaning the old cold storage areas, using industrial chemicals to eliminate any traces of his activities. He removed tools and equipment that might seem suspicious, transferring them to new hiding places. He reviewed his procedures, looking for vulnerabilities that inspections might expose. The work was exhausting, but necessary. The inspection teams did eventually examine the old storage areas, but they found nothing alarming. The rooms were dirty and obsolete, exactly what would be expected in abandoned spaces beneath a decades-old building. The inspectors made notes about structural issues and moved on to other areas. Brennan's thorough preparation had succeeded. The threat passed without incident, but the experience had shaken him. For the first time since arriving in Seattle, he recognized the precariousness of his situation. He had become comfortable, perhaps too comfortable. The close call reminded him that security was never permanent, that circumstances could change unexpectedly, and that vigilance had to remain constant. Summer arrived, bringing the peak tourist season. Pike Place Market overflowed with visitors from around the world. Business thrived. Brennan's days became exhaustingly busy, with lines of customers extending from his shop throughout much of the day. The intensity of the work left little time for acquisition activities. His inventory of special meat began running low, but opportunities for safely obtaining new supplies were limited during the high-visibility summer months. He decided to wait until autumn, when tourist traffic diminished and darkness came earlier. Patience had always been his greatest asset. A few months without acquiring new supplies would not destroy his business. He could supplement his special blend with conventional meat, slightly reducing the proportion of his unique ingredient. Customers might notice a subtle difference, but they would attribute it to seasonal variation in livestock quality. Detective Robert Morrison continued shopping at the butcher shop occasionally. His presence always made Brennan slightly uncomfortable, though he showed no outward sign of this discomfort. Morrison seemed to notice everything, his policeman's eyes constantly scanning and evaluating, but he appeared to see only what Brennan wanted him to see. A professional butcher, operating a successful business through hard work and dedication. One afternoon in August, Morrison arrived at the shop during a rare lull in customer traffic. He examined the display case with his usual careful attention before selecting several items. Brennan wrapped the purchases with his characteristic precision, and Morrison paid in cash, as he always did. The detective showed no indication that anything unusual had caught his attention. The transaction proceeded exactly like dozens before it. After Morrison left, Brennan experienced a moment of genuine relief. The detective's visits always created stress, even though they provided valuable intelligence about police activities and priorities. If Morrison had suspected anything, his behavior would have changed. The fact that he continued shopping at the store was evidence that Brennan's cover remained intact. The renovation work at Pike Place Market progressed throughout the summer. Construction crews appeared early each morning, creating noise and disruption that vendors found irritating but accepted as necessary. The work focused primarily on structural reinforcement and updated electrical systems. The market's operations continued despite the construction, though customers sometimes complained about the inconvenience. Brennan used the construction activity to his advantage. The constant presence of workers and equipment normalized unusual sounds and activities. The general disruption provided cover for his own preparations. He made modifications to his backroom workspace, improving drainage systems and upgrading his refrigeration equipment. The construction noise masked any sounds from his improvements. By September, the summer crush had ended, and the market returned to its more manageable autumn rhythm. Tourist numbers declined, local customers reclaimed the space, and the atmosphere became more relaxed. Brennan began planning his next acquisition. He had identified a promising candidate, a young man in his mid-20s, who had been living in his car near the Ballard Locks for several weeks. The man appeared to have no family in the area, no steady employment, and no strong social connections. He fit Brennan's criteria perfectly. The acquisition took place on a foggy night in early October. The young man accepted Brennan's offer of assistance without hesitation. He was unconscious within 2 minutes of entering the van. By 4 in the morning, the processing was complete, and Brennan was cleaning his workspace with his usual thoroughness. By noon that same day, the special ground meat was back in his display case, and customers were purchasing it with their typical enthusiasm. The young man's disappearance generated minimal investigation. A missing person report was filed by a social worker who had spoken with him at a homeless shelter, but with no family pushing for action and no evidence of foul play. The case received low priority. Detective Morrison and his colleagues never connected the disappearance to Pike Place Market or to the butcher shop that had served Seattle's families for 7 years. Brennan's confidence returned fully. The successful acquisition proved that his methods remained sound despite the earlier concerns about building inspections. He had navigated a potential crisis and emerged stronger. The autumn of 1985 seemed to promise continued security and success, but circumstances were already shifting in ways Brennan could not see. The building renovations had documented spaces that building officials wanted to examine more thoroughly. New health and safety regulations were being drafted that would require more comprehensive inspections of food service businesses. And somewhere in the accumulated documentation of Seattle's missing persons, patterns were beginning to emerge that might eventually capture an investigator's attention. The butcher of Pike Place Market continued his work, believing he had achieved the perfect balance between his public persona and his hidden activities. He had no way of knowing that his carefully constructed world would begin collapsing within months, destroyed by coincidence and the persistent investigation of people who refused to accept convenient explanations for troubling questions. The winter of 1985 arrived with unusual severity. Seattle, typically mild and rainy, experienced temperatures that dropped below freezing for extended periods. Snow fell multiple times, a rarity that disrupted the city's rhythm and created transportation chaos. Pike Place Market's cobblestones became treacherous with ice, and vendors struggled with heating systems inadequate for genuine cold. Business slowed as customers stayed home, avoiding the hazardous conditions. Thomas Brennan welcomed the harsh weather. Fewer customers meant less surveillance, more privacy, and greater operational security. The cold also improved his refrigeration efficiency, reducing his electrical costs and ensuring optimal preservation of his inventory. He continued arriving at 4:30 each morning, navigating the icy streets with practiced caution in his aging Ford sedan. The building renovations had paused for winter, with construction crews scheduled to return in spring. This hiatus eliminated the daily presence of workers and inspectors who had monitored the market throughout the previous months. Brennan appreciated the return to normalcy, though he remained vigilant about the renovations resuming eventually. The building plans and inspection reports existed somewhere in city archives, permanent records that documented spaces he preferred to keep forgotten. His business maintained adequate profitability, despite the weather-related decline in foot traffic. Regular customers continued their weekly visits, loyal to the quality they had come to expect. The special ground meat remained popular, though Brennan had been forced to reduce its availability slightly. His last acquisition in October had provided sufficient supply for several months, but he calculated that he would need to act again by late February or early March. The prospect of another acquisition created unusual anxiety. Brennan had performed these operations dozens of times across multiple cities over 3 decades, but recent circumstances had unsettled his confidence. The building inspections, though ultimately inconsequential, had reminded him of his vulnerability. The increasing sophistication of forensic science troubled him. News reports described DNA analysis techniques that could identify individuals from microscopic samples. Such technology threatened his entire methodology. He spent considerable time researching these developments, visiting the University of Washington Library, and reading scientific journals under the pretense of professional interest in food safety. The information he discovered was alarming. Forensic capabilities were advancing rapidly. Techniques that had seemed theoretical 5 years earlier were becoming standard investigative tools. Blood typing, tissue analysis, and genetic identification were revolutionizing criminal investigation. This knowledge forced Brennan to reconsider his security measures. His cleaning protocols, though thorough, might not eliminate all traces detectable by new analytical methods. His disposal techniques, effective against conventional investigation, might fail against forensic examination. The ledger he maintained in his hidden workspace represented evidence that could definitively establish his activities if ever discovered. His entire operation, successful for 7 years in Seattle and decades before that elsewhere, rested on assumptions about investigative limitations that might no longer be valid. January brought a crisis that had nothing to do with his criminal activities but threatened him nevertheless. The building that housed his Ballard apartment was sold to developers planning to demolish it and construct condominiums. All tenants received 90-day eviction notices. Brennan would need to find new housing by April, a disruption he had not anticipated and did not welcome. The search for appropriate housing consumed time and created unwanted interactions. He needed a place that offered privacy, minimal contact with neighbors, and no intrusive management. Such properties were increasingly rare in Seattle's rapidly appreciating real estate market. The technology boom was transforming the city, driving up prices, and attracting newcomers who competed for limited housing stock. After several weeks of searching, he found a small house in the Georgetown neighborhood, south of downtown, in an industrial area that remained relatively affordable. The house was old, poorly maintained, and isolated on a street of warehouses and light manufacturing facilities. The landlord was an elderly man who lived in California and managed the property through a local agent who seemed interested only in receiving monthly rent checks. Brennan signed a lease using his established false identity and paid 6 months in advance. The move occurred in early February. During a brief break in the winter weather, Brennan transported his minimal possessions in a single trip, taking care to ensure that nothing from his apartment could be connected to his activities at the market. The Georgetown house suited his needs adequately. It had a garage where he could park his car out of sight, a basement where he could store items he preferred not to keep at his apartment, and neighbors who worked day shifts and paid no attention to his comings and goings. Settling into the new location required several weeks of adjustment. Brennan established new routines, identified the house's quirks and vulnerabilities, and ensured that his security measures remained robust. The change was stressful but manageable. He had moved many times before, though always as part of leaving a city entirely, rather than simply relocating within it. March arrived with the gradual warming that characterized Pacific Northwest springs. The snow melted, rain returned to its normal patterns, and Pike Place Market's business increased as customers ventured out more frequently. The construction crews returned, resuming their renovation work with apparent determination to complete the project before summer tourist season began. The renewed construction presence increased Brennan's anxiety about his back room and the old storage areas beyond it. Workers were now accessing parts of the building that had been neglected for decades. Several times he observed construction supervisors consulting blueprints and discussing spaces he knew connected to his hidden workspace. The risk of discovery, though still relatively low, had increased noticeably. His inventory of special meat had nearly depleted. The time for another acquisition was approaching, but the conditions seemed increasingly unfavorable. The construction activity created unpredictable surveillance. The lengthening days reduced the hours of protective darkness, and his own psychological state had become uncertain in ways he found troubling. For the first time in his adult life, Thomas Brennan was experiencing something resembling doubt, not moral doubt about his actions, which he had long ago rationalized to his satisfaction, but practical doubt about the sustainability of his operation. The world was changing in ways that threatened his methodology. Technology, population density, and institutional oversight were all trending toward greater transparency and accountability. The gaps in surveillance that he exploited might be closing. He considered retirement. He had accumulated modest savings over the years, carefully managed through legitimate banking channels. He could sell his business, leave Seattle, and live quietly somewhere remote. The idea held appeal but also seemed like surrender. He had dedicated his entire adult life to perfecting his craft. Walking away would mean abandoning his life's work. The decision was ultimately made for him by circumstances beyond his control. On a Tuesday morning, in late March, Seattle Public Health Department inspectors arrived at Pike Place Market for routine examinations of all food service vendors. These inspections occurred periodically, focusing on sanitation practices, proper refrigeration, and compliance with health codes. Brennan had passed such inspections many times without difficulty. This inspection began routinely. The lead inspector, a woman named Patricia Hoffman, who had been with the health department for 15 years, examined his display case, checked his refrigeration temperatures, and reviewed his sanitation procedures. Everything met or exceeded requirements. She seemed prepared to issue her standard approval and move to the next vendor. But then she asked to see his back room and storage areas. This was not unusual. Inspectors typically examined entire food preparation spaces, Brennan unlocked the first door and allowed her inside, showing her his legitimate supplies and equipment. Everything was impeccably clean and properly organized. Hoffman nodded approvingly, making notes on her clipboard. Then she noticed the second steel door at the back of the room. She inquired about what lay beyond it. Brennan explained it was old storage space, unused and unnecessary for his operations. Hoffman insisted on examining it nonetheless. The building renovations had generated new protocols, requiring documentation of all spaces in commercial food facilities. Brennan had no legitimate reason to refuse. Declining would create suspicion. He unlocked the second door with the key from around his neck, his mind racing through calculations about what she might observe and how he might explain it. He had cleaned the space thoroughly after his last use, but absolute certainty was impossible. The inner room appeared innocent enough at first glance. Stainless steel walls, industrial lighting, a large work table. Hoffman examined the space with professional attention, noting the drainage system and the specialized lockers. She asked about their purpose. Brennan explained they were for bulk storage and aging certain cuts of meat, a practice that improved flavor and texture. Hoffman seemed satisfied with this explanation. She was preparing to leave when she noticed something near one of the floor drains. She knelt down for closer examination. What she saw was barely visible, just a slight discoloration in the grouting around the drain. In most circumstances it would have gone unnoticed, but Hoffman had years of experience identifying sanitation issues. She took a sample using a swab from her inspection kit. Brennan watched with carefully controlled expression, calculating odds and responses. The sample might show nothing conclusive, even if it indicated biological material that could be explained by his legitimate butchery work. Blood and tissue were inevitable in his profession. Dub Hoffman was thorough. She also noticed scratches on the stainless steel walls that suggested heavy use, inconsistent with Brennan's claim that the space was rarely utilized. She documented these observations, though she did not voice her suspicions. Her report would note the anomalies for follow-up investigation. The inspection concluded with Brennan receiving conditional approval pending analysis of the sample and further examination of his extended storage areas. Hoffman was professional and courteous, giving no indication that she suspected anything beyond possible sanitation issues. But Brennan understood the implications. The sample, if analyzed properly, might reveal traces that would prompt deeper investigation. He spent the afternoon weighing his options with cold calculation. He could abandon everything immediately, disappearing before analysis results returned. This would mean leaving behind his business, his established identity, and his accumulated assets. It would also create suspicion, effectively confirming that something was wrong. Alternatively, he could remain and hope the analysis revealed nothing actionable. This preserved his current situation, but risked catastrophic consequences if the investigation expanded. The decision was complicated by the fact that Hoffman had documented the second room's existence. Building officials and health inspectors now had official records showing that space, even if he cleaned it perfectly, the documentation would remain. Future inspections would examine it. The sanctuary he had created was no longer secure. That night Brennan made his choice. He would remain for now, but prepare for immediate departure. If circumstances required, he would clean the inner room even more thoroughly than before, using the most aggressive chemical agents available. He would destroy the ledger, eliminating the most damning evidence of his activities, and he would suspend all acquisition activities indefinitely, living off his remaining inventory until the situation clarified. Over the next week, he executed this plan with meticulous care. He spent several nights at the market, arriving well after midnight and working until dawn. He dismantled equipment that might seem suspicious, transported it to his Georgetown house, and stored it in the basement. He used industrial cleaning compounds to eliminate every trace of biological material from the inner room, and he burned his ledger page by page in the fireplace of his rental house, watching decades of documentation turn to ash. The preliminary analysis of Hoffman's sample returned inconclusive results. The laboratory detected biological material, but could not definitively identify its source or nature. The health department scheduled a more detailed follow-up inspection for early April, this time including representatives from the city building department who wanted to examine the old storage areas as part of the ongoing renovation assessment. Brennan prepared for this inspection as though it were a military operation. He reviewed every detail of his backroom setup, considered every possible question, and rehearsed responses that would seem logical and innocent. The stress was taking physical toll. He lost weight, developed insomnia, and found concentration difficult. For the first time since arriving in Seattle, he looked like a man under pressure. The follow-up inspection occurred on April 15th. A team of 4 officials arrived: Patricia Hoffman, her supervisor, a building inspector, and a structural engineer. They spent 2 hours examining Brennan's shop, the back room, the inner workspace, and the old storage areas beyond. They measured, photographed, sampled, and documented everything. Brennan maintained his composure throughout, answering questions politely and providing access to everything requested. His cleaning had been thorough. They found nothing obviously incriminating, but the building inspector noted that the old storage areas violated current code requirements and would need to be either brought into compliance or permanently sealed during the renovation project. This mandate effectively ended Brennan's operation. If the storage areas were sealed, his access to that space and its disposal opportunities would terminate. If they were renovated to meet current codes, the intensive work would likely uncover evidence his cleaning had not eliminated. Either outcome was unacceptable. The inspectors left without indicating they suspected serious wrongdoing, but their report would document everything they had observed. Brennan understood that institutional memory was permanent. Even if this particular investigation concluded without action, the records would exist forever. Future inspectors, future investigators, future researchers examining old files might notice connections he could not anticipate. That evening, sitting in his Georgetown house, Thomas Brennan faced the reality he had avoided acknowledging for months. His Seattle operation was finished. The conditions that had made it successful no longer existed. Technology, bureaucracy, and simple bad luck had converged to eliminate his security. Continuing would mean accepting risks that had become unacceptable. He began planning his departure. He would sell the business to another butcher, explaining that he wanted to retire. He would leave Seattle quietly, establishing a new identity elsewhere and starting over yet again. He was 54 years old, still physically capable, still possessing the skills and knowledge he had refined across 3 decades. Other cities existed. Other opportunities waited. The sale of the business took 6 weeks to arrange. Brennan found a buyer through a commercial broker, a young butcher from Spokane, who wanted to establish himself in Seattle's growing food scene. The price was fair, the transaction was legitimate, and the transfer proceeded smoothly. By the end of May, the shop had a new owner, new products, and a new identity. Thomas Brennan departed Seattle on a foggy morning in early June, driving south toward California in his Ford sedan. He carried minimal possessions, substantial cash, and the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime pursuing his particular craft. He left behind a successful business, a reputation for quality, and hundreds of customers who would remember him fondly as the dedicated butcher, whose products had been genuinely distinctive. What he did not leave behind was evidence sufficient for prosecution. The health department investigation concluded that while some irregularities existed, no definitive violations could be established. The samples proved inconclusive. The irregular use of storage space was attributed to eccentricity rather than criminality. The case file was marked complete and archived. Detective Robert Morrison heard about the butcher's retirement through casual conversation at the market. He felt vague disappointment that his source for quality steaks had closed, but thought nothing more about it. The connection between Brennan's shop and the occasional missing persons cases Morrison had worked over the years never occurred to him. Why would it? The butcher had been a respected businessman, a craftsman who took pride in his work. The old cold storage areas beneath Pike Place Market were sealed permanently during the renovation project's final phase. Construction crews filled them with concrete, eliminating the spaces entirely. Whatever traces remained of Thomas Brennan's activities were entombed forever beneath tons of hardened material, hidden from discovery, protected from analysis. The market continued thriving. New vendors replaced old ones. Tourist traffic grew. Seattle's transformation accelerated. The Boeing Aerospace Company and Microsoft Corporation drove unprecedented economic expansion. The city that Brennan had known was rapidly becoming something different, more prosperous and sophisticated, but also more regulated and surveilled. Brennan himself surfaced briefly in Portland 6 months later, working at a small butcher shop in the suburbs, under yet another false identity. But Portland proved unsuitable for his purposes. The city was too small, the community too tight-knit, the opportunities too limited. After only 3 months, he moved on again. Over the following years he appeared periodically in different locations throughout the western United States. Always he worked as a butcher, always he maintained low profile, always he sought the conditions that might allow him to resume his true vocation. But those conditions were becoming increasingly rare. The world was changing in ways that made his lifestyle progressively more difficult to sustain. By 1990, Thomas Brennan had essentially retired from active operations. He was 60 years old, his physical capabilities were declining, and the risk calculation had shifted decisively against continuing. He settled in a small town in rural Nevada, working part-time at a local grocery store's meat counter, living alone in a mobile home, attracting no attention. He died there in 2003, at age 70, apparently from heart failure. The death was unremarkable, generating only a brief obituary in the local newspaper that mentioned his former work as a butcher in several western cities. No one attended his funeral except the mortuary staff. His few possessions were disposed of by the landlord of his mobile home park. Nothing in his effects suggested the life he had actually lived. Pike Place Market continued its existence, iconic and beloved, attracting millions of visitors annually. The butcher shop that Brennan had operated changed hands several more times over the years. The current owners knew nothing of its history, nothing of the man who had built its original reputation. The market's official history made no mention of Thomas Brennan. He had vanished completely from institutional memory. But in the homes of Seattle, in the memories of customers who had shopped at his counter through the early 1980s, Brennan survived as a vague positive recollection. People who had purchased his special ground meat occasionally wondered whatever happened to that butcher shop that had such distinctive products. Some remembered his name, most did not. None suspected the truth. The Seattle Police Department's missing persons files from 1978 through 1985 remained unsolved. 17 individuals who had disappeared during those years were never found. Their cases stayed open officially, though no active investigation continued. The files contained no references to Pike Place Market or to Thomas Brennan. No connection had ever been established between the missing persons and the respected butcher who had served the community with such apparent dedication. The truth died with Brennan in that Nevada mobile home. No confession emerged, no evidence surfaced, no investigation reopened the questions about those vanished individuals. The meat that thousands of Seattle families had consumed with such satisfaction had come from sources they never suspected and would never know. The butcher of Pike Place Market had achieved what few serial criminals accomplish: a successful career spanning decades, concluded by peaceful retirement and natural death. He had evaded justice completely, not through dramatic escapes or clever misdirection, but through careful planning, disciplined execution, and the exploitation of social conditions that allowed certain activities to occur beneath official notice. His story remained unknown, his crimes undetected, his victims unidentified. In the end, Thomas Brennan had proven that in a society focused on the present and future, the careful predator who operated patiently in the margins could indeed remain invisible indefinitely. His success was not a failure of investigation but a demonstration of how much can be hidden when no one knows to look. The market still stands, the vendors still work, the customers still shop, and somewhere in the concrete that sealed the old storage areas, evidence remains of what once occurred there, waiting silently for discovery that will never come, preserving secrets that will never be revealed, documenting horror that will never be acknowledged. The fog still rolls in from Elliott Bay on certain mornings, just as it did when Thomas Brennan first arrived in Seattle decades ago. The market still smells of fish and coffee and fresh bread, and the memory of a talented butcher who served his community with distinctive products slowly fades into the comfortable obscurity of forgotten history. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe and hit the like button. Your support helps us create more content like this. Thank you for watching.